I called my husband to pick me up. He snapped. "You're a burden. Figure it out." Minutes later, I saw him with another woman. Welcome to her revenge. Enjoy my new story. 8 months pregnant. I fled the mansion in the middle of a storm after hearing my husband and sister mention a plan that would make no one believe me anymore. A plan meant to erase me completely. On the empty road, a truck came tearing out of the rain. But a man on a motorcycle suddenly cut through the storm and slammed into its front end, forcing it off course. I rushed him to the hospital, his shirt soaked with blood because he had saved my life. The next morning, 3 black SUVs surrounded the place where I was hiding, and his first words turned my blood cold. "If you made it to this point, I'm truly grateful you stayed. Tell me where you are in the world, country, city, wherever you're watching from. Your comment means more than a like ever could." Quick note: parts of this story are fictional, shaped for entertainment and meaningful reflection. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental. But what this story is trying to say to you, that part is entirely intentional. There are moments in life you can look back on and say that was the line. On one side you are one person, on the other side you are someone else entirely. For me that line was a door left slightly open, a thin strip of amber light spilling out from my father's old study, and the voice of the man I had built my entire life around. My father used to say when he was teaching me to restore antiques, "The most dangerous fakes are the ones that look most real, Caroline, because you only discover the truth when you look at what's underneath." He meant artifacts, bronze vessels, painted porcelain, things that had been altered so carefully that only an expert eye and patience could find where the lie began. I thought I understood what he meant. I didn't. Not until that night. My name is Caroline Sterling. I am 31 years old, and until 8 months ago, I would have described my life as exactly what I had worked for. I run the restoration division of Sterling Holdings, the company my father, Edward Sterling, built over 40 years from a single gallery on the Upper East Side into one of the most respected names in American private art. I am good at my work. I am precise. I know how to look at something broken and understand what it used to be. I am also 8 months pregnant, which means that for the past several weeks, I have not slept through a single night. That night, it was the lower back pain that got me up. I pulled on my robe, left Grant sleeping, or what I believed was Grant sleeping, and went downstairs to the kitchen for water and whatever combination of pillows and patience might get me through until morning. The kitchen was dark. The hallway was dark. But the study, my father's study, which Grant had taken over after we married and moved into the Sterling estate, had light coming from under the door. And then I heard Seraphina's voice. My sister never came to the house at this hour. She had her own apartment in the West Village. And whatever complicated relationship she had with Grant, it had always stayed on the surface of things. Dinner parties, gallery events, the kind of proximity that looked like family but never quite felt like it. Hearing her voice at nearly midnight behind a closed door with the low and deliberate cadence of someone not expecting to be overheard, that was the thing that made me stop. I stood in the hallway and I listened. "The paperwork needs to be filed before she can contest it," Grant said. "Once the physician's signatures are in place, we have 72 hours," and Dr. Harmon agreed. That was Seraphina. He owes me. I knew exactly what they were describing. As the sole heir to Sterling Holdings, I had spent years working alongside our legal team, and the language Grant was using, involuntary psychiatric evaluation, physician signatures, 72-hour hold. That was New York Mental Hygiene Law Section 9.27. Under that law, if 2 licensed physicians sign off on an involuntary hold, a person can be committed to a psychiatric facility for up to 72 hours without a court order. No judge, no hearing, no warning. I was 8 months pregnant. 72 hours in a psychiatric facility at this stage of pregnancy was not a risk. It was a sentence. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I stood in that hallway in the dark with my hand pressed flat against the wall to keep myself steady, and I listened until I had heard enough. Then I took out my phone, opened the camera, and held it at the gap where the door had not fully latched. The angle was narrow. The image was dim. Grant's back, a stack of papers on the desk. The edge of Serafina's profile. Not enough for a courtroom. But enough for me to know I was not imagining this. Enough to know that what I had been feeling for months, that faint persistent wrongness I had attributed to pregnancy hormones and stress, had a name and a document and a physician attached to it. I stopped recording. I went back upstairs. I moved the way I used to move when I was working on a fragile piece, slowly. Deliberately. No wasted motion. I changed out of my robe. I put on real clothes. I took my wallet from the nightstand drawer. My car keys from the hook inside the closet. And the small personal folder I kept behind my winter coats. The one with copies of documents I had quietly made over the past 2 months. For reasons I had not fully admitted to myself until right now. Grant had installed a location tracking application on my phone 6 weeks ago. I had found it. I had said nothing because the moment he knew I had found it, whatever advantage I had would be gone. Calling my attorney from inside this house meant Grant would know within minutes. I had to get out first. I walked down the hallway toward the garage entrance and I passed the glass display case near the stairs. The one that held 3 pieces. I was currently mid-restoration, including the sterling dawn, a 19th century Chinese export vase that had been in my family for decades. I paused for just a moment looking at it through the glass. Then I kept walking. The garage was cold and smelled like motor oil and concrete. I got into my car, put the key in the ignition, and the headlights came on and lit up the wall in front of me white blank, offering nothing. I sat there for 3 seconds. Then I backed out. The rain hit the windshield the moment I cleared the garage door, heavy, immediate. The kind of rain that doesn't build up gradually, but arrives all at once. I pulled out onto the street and drove without a destination because the only thing I knew for certain in that moment was this. The phone in my bag was sending my location to Grant's device. And I had 15 minutes, maybe less, before he realized I was gone. 15 minutes to figure out what came next. 15 minutes. I had calculated correctly what was waiting for me out on that highway. I never could have calculated that. Later, much later, when I finally understood the full shape of what Silas had been doing for 8 months. He told me that Grant's contractor had sent a confirmation message that evening through an encrypted channel Silas had been monitoring since the 3rd month of his watch. The message named the road. It named the hour. Silas had been moving before I had even reached the garage door. I drove without direction for the first few miles, which is not something I recommend when you are 8.5 months pregnant and your hands will not stop shaking. The rain had thickened into something almost solid, the kind that makes the road ahead look like a wall of moving grey. And I kept both hands on the wheel and told myself to breathe. My father's voice came to me somewhere on the expressway, the way his voice always did in moments I least expected it. Take care of yourself first, Caroline. Everything else can be rebuilt. You cannot. He had said that when I was 18. I had nicked my hand on a restoration tool during a training session. Nothing serious. But I had kept working anyway, bleeding quietly over a 300-year-old lacquer box because I did not want to stop. He pulled me away from the table. He said those words. I had thought at the time he was talking about the lacquer box. I was not thinking about lacquer boxes now. I pulled off at a gas station on the edge of the expressway. Fluorescent lights. 2 pumps. A 24-hour mart with a tired attendant visible through the glass. I went inside and found what I needed near the back. A prepaid phone in a plastic clamshell package. In the United States, prepaid phones are sold legally without registration. No ID required. No name attached to the purchase. $22 paid in cash from the emergency money I kept folded behind my driver's license. 5 minutes. Then I was back on the road. I called Grace from the new phone. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was already awake. Grace Moore had been my closest friend since we were 9 years old. And for the past 6 years, she had been working night shifts in the emergency room at Manhattan General. Late nights were her natural state. Caroline. Her voice shifted the moment she heard me. What's wrong? I'll explain when I see you. I'm driving. I'm okay. You don't sound okay. Okay enough. I said. I just needed to hear your voice. She stayed on the line for another minute without asking questions. which is one of the things I have always loved about Grace. Then I told her I would call again soon and hung up. I kept driving. The road thinned as I moved further from the city. Fewer street lights. Fewer cars. The rain stayed heavy and the visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet in front of my headlights, which meant I was moving almost entirely on instinct and the faint white lines disappearing beneath my tires. I saw the truck's headlights at the intersection. They came from the cross street to my right. No slowing. No signal. No hesitation. Just two white points of light growing fast in the dark and the low engine deep sound of something large moving at full speed. I yanked the wheel left. My car fishtailed on the wet surface, the rear end swinging wide before I caught it, my heart hitting the inside of my chest hard enough to hurt. For 1 second, I thought I had cleared it. Then from the left lane, out of nothing, out of the dark and rain, a motorcycle came in at a sharp diagonal and hit the truck's front quarter panel. The impact was never going to stop a vehicle that size. But what it did was exactly enough. The truck driver jerked the wheel in pure reflex. The kind of correction you cannot train out of a human being. At that speed on that road surface in that rain, the physics finished the rest. The rear end swung out in a long shriek of wet rubber. The tires lost traction completely and the whole vehicle tipped and slid sideways into the guardrail with a sound like a building collapsing in slow motion. The motorcycle was thrown wide. I hit the brakes hard. My car skidded and came to a stop half on the shoulder, engines still running. I sat there for 3 full seconds with both hands locked on the wheel listening to rain and the sound of settling metal. Then I got out. Before I moved toward the man on the road, I did one thing first. I called 911 from the prepaid phone and gave the dispatcher the highway name, the approximate mile marker I had passed, and a description of the truck on its side against the guardrail. In New York, you are legally required to report an accident if you witness it. Leaving the scene without reporting is a violation. Regardless of your involvement, I was not leaving without making that call. The dispatcher told me units were being dispatched. I told her there was an injured man and I was taking him to Manhattan General. She told me to stay on the line. I told her I could not. The man was face down on the asphalt about 40 feet back. Dark jacket. Dark jeans. Completely still. I moved toward him as fast as I could, which at 8½ months was not fast, but it was everything I had. I crouched beside him and put my hand on his left shoulder. The right side of his jacket was soaked through with dark blood. "Hey, can you hear me? Can you move?" He did not answer with words, but his fingers pressed flat against the wet road and his head turned slowly with visible effort and he looked up at me. "Conscious. Barely. But conscious. I'm getting you to a hospital," I said. "But I need you to help me. I can't lift you. You have to give me something." He blinked once. Then he started to push himself up. It took nearly 3 minutes. I braced his left arm across my shoulders and kept my back against the open car door for leverage, letting him do the work of rising while I held the anchor point steady. He made no sound through any of it. Not one. But I could see what it cost him in the set of his jaw. The way it locked and released with every movement. Twice I had to stop because a sharp tightening moved across my abdomen and I had to wait breathing through it before I could continue. He made it into the back seat. I called ahead to the Manhattan General Trauma Unit from the car. In the US, pre-arrival notification allows the ER to prepare a bay and have a team ready before the patient arrives, which can save critical minutes in cases involving blood loss or head trauma. I gave them what I had. Adult male motorcycle accident. Right shoulder. Laceration. Possible concussion. Intermittent loss of consciousness. Then I drove and I kept talking to him because the silence felt like something I could not afford to let settle. About 10 minutes from the hospital, I checked the mirror. He was looking at me. Not glassy. Not unfocused. But with the full and quiet attention of someone who had been watching longer than this moment. His mouth moved. "Silas," he said. Then his eyes closed. In the seconds before he lost consciousness, I saw his left hand move slow, deliberate to the inside pocket of his jacket. He pressed something there once. Then his arm went still. I didn't understand it then. I understood it later when Hale called. I pressed the accelerator down and did not lift my foot until I saw the hospital lights. When I pulled into the ambulance bay at Manhattan General, I held the horn down until figures and scrubs came running with a gurney. I stepped out into the cold and the noise and the hard white light, and across the organized chaos of rolling equipment and called instructions. I found one still point in all of it. Grace was standing at the ER entrance in her scrubs, a chart held loose at her side, staring at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 22 years of friendship. Like she was looking at someone who was not supposed to be standing there. Like she was looking at a ghost. The emergency waiting room at 2 o'clock in the morning has its own particular quality of light. Fluorescent white flat. And total, the kind that leaves no shadows and no place to hide. I sat in a hard plastic chair with my coat still on and my hands folded in my lap. And I could see the dried blood on my right knuckles where I had pressed against Silas's shoulder, trying to keep him upright. I did not look away from it. I was not ready to look away from it yet. Grace sat down beside me without a word. She simply placed her hand over mine, warm and steady, the way she had been doing since we were 9 years old, sitting outside the principal's office, waiting for my father to arrive after I had broken a display case in the school lobby accidentally, but convincingly enough to require explanation. 22 years of friendship teaches you when words are the wrong tool entirely. We sat like that for maybe 2 minutes. Then she said quietly, "Tell me everything." So, I did. I told her about the study door. The amber light Grant's voice saying the paperwork needs to be filed before she can contest it. I told her about the prepaid phone and the highway and the truck coming out of the intersection without slowing, without signaling like it had somewhere very specific to be. I told her about the man on the wet asphalt and the 3 minutes it took to get him upright and the one word he had said before he lost consciousness in my back seat. I told her all of it in the flattest voice I could manage because if I let any inflection into it, I was not sure I would be able to stop. Grace listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked only one question. "Does Grant know where you are right now?" I shook my head. I had switched phones. I had not used my car's built-in navigation system, which was connected to an app Grant had access to. I had paid for gas and cash. "Good," Grace said. She nodded once the way she did when she was shifting into a different mode. Not friend mode. The other one. The one that had kept her functional through 12-hour trauma shifts for 6 years. She stood up. "Stay here." She was gone for 4 minutes. I counted. When she came back, she had a cup of terrible vending machine coffee that I could not drink because of the pregnancy. And she said it in front of me anyway because the gesture was the point. She sat back down and that was when the phone in my coat pocket started to vibrate. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. No name. No area code I recognized. I held it out toward Grace without thinking, the way you reach for the person next to you when something startles you in the dark. She looked at the screen. "Answer it," she said. I pressed the phone to my ear. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone accustomed to delivering information that other people found alarming. "Miss Sterling. My name is Robert Hale. I was your father's private attorney for 11 years. I need you to listen carefully and I need you to not ask me how I know what I know until I have finished speaking." I said nothing. He took that as permission to continue. "The man they just took into surgery. His name is Silas Thorne. For the past 8 months on your father's specific instructions. He has been watching over you. What happened tonight on that highway was not an accident. Your husband is on his way to this hospital right now. Based on what I know of his resources, you have perhaps 20 minutes before he arrives." The waiting room did not change. The fluorescent light stayed exactly as flat and white as it had been. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Everything around me continued being completely ordinary, and I stood in the middle of it, feeling the floor of everything I understood tilt very slightly to the left. "How did you get this number?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. "Silas sent it to me 7 minutes before he lost consciousness from a secondary device he carried separately from anything registered to his name. He had a protocol established for exactly this situation. And that protocol included a way to reach me that did not depend on his being conscious to execute it." "What situation?" A brief pause. Not hesitation. more like the pause of someone choosing how much a door should open. The situation in which he was no longer able to protect you directly. And you needed to know that you were not alone. Miss Sterling, I will explain everything. But not tonight and not on this phone. Right now. The only thing that matters is that you are not in that building when your husband walks through the front entrance. The line went quiet. Not disconnected. Just quiet like he was waiting. I lowered the phone and looked at Grace. She was already looking past me toward the wall of glass at the front of the waiting room that faced the hospital's main parking structure. I turned and followed her line of sight. A dark sedan had pulled into the drop-off lane outside. The headlights were still on, cutting twin beams through the rain-wet glass. And even from this distance and through 2 layers of window, I could see the way the driver's door opened and the silhouette that stepped out moved with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. I knew that walk. I had watched it cross 100 rooms. Grace's hand closed around my wrist. Not gently. With purpose. Come with me, she said. Right now. It was not a question. And she did not wait for me to form one. I stood. I took one look back at the double doors that led to the surgical wing. The one Silas Thorne had been wheeled through 40 minutes ago. Sedated. Bleeding. Entirely unaware of what was unfolding on the other side of them. I thought about the word he had said in my backseat. Just his name. Like a fact he needed me to have. Then I turned away from those doors and followed Grace into the corridor. The storage room at the end of the corridor smelled like antiseptic and cardboard. And it was approximately the size of a generous closet. Grace had pointed me toward it without ceremony. In here. Door stays closed. You don't come out. And I had done exactly what she said, because there are people in your life who, when everything is falling, don't ask if you're sure and don't ask why. They just ask what needs to happen next. Grace had been that person for 22 years, and I understood, standing in the dark between a shelf of gauze rolls and a broken 4-pole, that I had never fully appreciated what that meant until this moment. I thought about the first time I saw Grant. It was 3 years ago at a private auction on the Upper East Side. One of those evenings where the guest list was smaller than the insurance value of the room. A Flemish oil painting from the 17th century was the centerpiece of the sale. A merchant scene with that particular amber depth that only real age produces. I had been studying it for 10 minutes when I noticed the man standing 2 feet to my left. He was looking at the same painting. But not the way I was looking at it. I was reading at the brushwork. The craquure. The way the varnish had yellowed unevenly at the lower left corner in a pattern consistent with the period. He was calculating it. There was no other word for that expression. He was looking at something beautiful and seeing only what it was worth to own. I had mistaken that for sophistication. I understood now in this storage room in the dark that what I had seen was instinct. The instinct of something that identifies value and acquires it. And I had been the acquisition. I had been the acquisition from the very first evening. Through the gap where the storage room door had not fully latched. I watched Grant walk into the emergency department. He was wearing a dark suit. Not the one he had been wearing at dinner. Which meant he had changed. Which meant he had taken time to compose himself before coming here. His hair was neat. His expression was arranged into something that read from a distance as controlled concern. The kind of face you practice. He moved to the nurse's station and said something to the attendant there. And within 2 minutes, Grace appeared from the side corridor. I could not hear the exchange. The distance and the ambient noise of the department swallowed everything. But I watched it in the way I had been trained to watch things, for the details that the surface is designed to conceal. Grant set a white envelope on the counter between them and slid it across with 2 fingers. Not handed, slid, the gesture of someone who has done this before and knows how to make it look like nothing. Grace looked down at the envelope. She looked up at Grant. She nodded. Grant smiled, the smile that stopped at the exact line where his eyes began. And then he followed the direction a staff member indicated toward the patient ward. Grace came back to me 4 minutes later. She opened the storage room door, stepped inside, and pulled it closed behind her. She was holding a syringe in her open palm. Still capped. Still sealed. He wants me to administer a sedative, she said. High dose. I told him I would. She looked at the syringe for a moment, then set it on the shelf beside the gauze. I'm going to document this as a witness refusal of treatment instead. She explained it quickly and precisely the way she explained everything medical. No softening. No preamble. Under New York law, a patient has the right to leave a medical facility at any time against the advice of their care team. The process is called an against medical advice discharge. AMA. The attending nurse on duty can document and witness it. No judge. No specialist signature required for the documentation itself. Grace was the attending nurse on duty. She would record that Caroline Sterling had been present, had been informed of the medical risks of leaving, and had chosen to go anyway. Signed. Witnessed, filed. Completely legal. Completely unremarkable. Silas was more complicated, but not impossibly so. Robert Hale had already sent a medical power of attorney by fax to the hospital's administrative line. Hale told me later that Silas maintained a standing PA document updated every quarter that could be transmitted to any receiving medical facility on a single encrypted instruction. That instruction had gone out from Silas's secondary device in the same 7-minute window before he lost consciousness. The same window in which he had contacted Hale with my new number. He had prepared for this before I ever knew there was anything to prepare for. A document her father's attorney apparently kept prepared for situations that I was only beginning to understand the shape of. It authorized the transfer of Silas Thorne's care to an alternate facility under the direction of his designated representative. Grace would record it as a standard inter-facility transfer initiated by the patient's legal representative. The receiving facility was a private care clinic outside the city. Quiet. Unaffiliated with any of Grant's network. What about Grant? I asked. When he doesn't find me in the ward, he'll find your car. Grace said. Your plates. The accident report. A vehicle registered to Caroline Sterling. Totaled on the highway, driver unaccounted for. She paused. I'm not telling him anything. I'm not filing anything false. He'll draw his own conclusions from what's already there. She picked up the sealed syringe from the shelf and pocketed it. That's his mistake to make. Not mine. I understood what she was saying. Grant's entire model of control depended on knowing where I was. Remove the signal and he would fill the silence with the explanation that suited him best. A woman 8.5 months pregnant. A wrecked car. No body. No hospital record. His mind would go where his guilt pointed it. Grace had given him nothing false. She had simply stopped giving him anything at all. 40 minutes later, Silas was on a gurney being wheeled toward the hospital's service exit. He was unconscious. The surgery had gone without complication. Grace told me, but the anesthesia would hold him for hours. White gauze bandaging wrapped from his right shoulder across his chest. Under the harsh service corridor lighting, I finally saw his face clearly for the first time. Strong jaw. Faint scar along the left temple. The particular stillness of someone who, even unconscious, did not look entirely unguarded. He was a complete stranger. I did not know a single thing about him beyond his first name and the fact that he had driven a motorcycle into the front panel of a truck that was about to kill me. And yet, according to Robert Hale, this man had spent 8 months keeping watch over my life. The gurney wheels hit the door threshold and the service exit opened onto the cold, dark outside. A private ambulance was already backed into position. A contact of Grace's, she said. A licensed transport service that did not ask unnecessary questions in exchange for the kind of referrals that kept a small operation running. I climbed in after the gurney. The doors closed. The transport team. 2 people Grace had worked with before. Licensed and quiet. Told me Silas had been stabilized sufficiently for short-distance transfer. Not recovered. Stabilized. There is a difference. And I was beginning to understand it. Through the small rear window. As the vehicle pulled away, I could see the hospital receding. And on the 3rd floor, a row of windows still lit. Grant was up there somewhere. Walking a ward where neither of us existed anymore. Looking for something he was not going to find. I did not know what conclusion he would reach by morning. I only knew that whatever he decided to believe, the gap between that belief and the truth was the only thing standing between me and whatever came next. The ambulance turned onto the service road and the hospital lights disappeared behind a stand of bare trees. I pressed my hand against my stomach. The baby moved slow, deliberate, like a reminder. We were still here. Both of us. For now. That was enough. The thing I had always loved about Grace's apartment was the living room window. It faced west, which meant the morning light came in at an angle that turned everything gold for about 40 minutes before the building across the street blocked it. I had sat in that light more times than I could count over the years. Hung over once in college, heartbroken twice in my 20s, and on one occasion just tired enough that Grace had handed me a blanket and told me I could stay until I felt like a human being again. That window had always meant something uncomplicated to me, something safe. When I pulled back the curtain that morning, safety was not what I found. 3 black SUVs were parked along the opposite curb in a loose formation, engines running, windows completely dark, not staggered the way parallel parked cars naturally fall positioned. Deliberate spacing, clear sight lines to the building entrance. They had been there since before I woke up. Grace told me when I called her name. Since before 5. She appeared from the kitchen and set a mug of tea on the windowsill beside me without comment. Hot 2 sugars. She had been making it the same way since we were teenagers and I had never once had to ask. I picked it up and held it in both hands and focused on the warmth spreading into my palms because it was the only thing in the room that felt entirely real. "They're not police," I said. "No." Grace agreed. "Police don't sit still like that. Not press either. No equipment visible. No one outside the vehicles. Just 3 dark shapes breathing exhaust into the cold morning air. Watching a building where 2 of them apparently suspected someone was still alive." The prepaid phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I crossed the room and answered before the second vibration. Robert Hale's voice was the same as it had been at 2 in the morning. Unhurried. Precise. Giving nothing extra. "Don't open the front door. Stay away from the windows facing the street. I'm sending someone to you now." "Who?" I asked. "The same person who intercepted the truck last night. He's already on his way." I looked at Grace across the kitchen. She looked back at me with the expression she reserved for situations she had decided to be steady through regardless of what she actually felt. We waited. 12 minutes later. 3 knocks came at the back door. A pause. Then 2 more. Grace moved to the door. She checked the peephole first, then unlatched the deadbolt and opened it. Silas Thorne walked in from the service corridor. It had been nearly 8 hours since the surgery, enough time the private clinic's attending physician had apparently decided for a man with Silas's particular tolerance for pain and his particular reasons for needing to move to be discharged into his own care with strict instructions he would follow selectively. He was still in the clothes they had put on him after surgery. Dark pants. A grey shirt with the right side cut away to accommodate the thick white bandaging that wrapped from his shoulder down across his chest. He moved carefully, one hand briefly touching the door frame as he cleared the threshold. And I could see in the set of his jaw what each step cost him. But his eyes were something else entirely. Sharp and still. And taking in everything in the room within the first 2 seconds of entering the way. A person looks at a space when they are assessing it, rather than simply seeing it. He went directly to the window and looked through the gap in the curtain at the 3 SUVs below. He stood there without speaking for a long moment. Then he said, "He knows you're alive, Caroline. He's been watching this building since for this morning. And he's not here to ask questions. He's here to make sure the answer he wants is the only one left." I watched him say this the way I would watch someone handle an object I was trying to date. Looking for inconsistencies for the place where the surface didn't match what was underneath. There were none that I could find. He said it the way someone states a fact they have verified rather than one they are guessing at. I said, "Who are you and why did my father trust you with my life?" He turned from the window and looked at me directly. It was the first time we had been in the same room with both of us fully conscious. And there was something disorienting about it. This face I had seen only in the half-dark of a wet highway and the harsh fluorescence of a hospital corridor. Now standing in Grace's kitchen in the ordinary grey light of a March morning. He did not look away from the question. But he did not answer it immediately either. "I'll explain everything," he said. "But not here and not while those vehicles are outside. Is there anything you need to take with you? Where are we going?" "Somewhere they can't follow a signal to." I stood in the kitchen of my oldest friend's apartment, 8.5 months pregnant, with a mug of tea going cold in my hands. And I looked at this man, this stranger who had driven into a truck to keep me alive and was now standing in front of me with bandaging visible through a cut shirt, asking me to follow him somewhere unspecified. Every reasonable instinct I had said this was exactly the kind of situation my father had warned me about. Don't move without information. Don't trust without evidence. Don't let urgency be used as a substitute for clarity. But my father apparently had trusted this man with my life before I ever had the chance to form an opinion. I set the mug down on the counter. I looked one last time through the gap in the curtain at the 3 black shapes idling on the street below. Patient, deliberate, waiting for a confirmation that was not going to come if I kept moving. Then I turned back to Silas. Then start talking while we move. I said. He nodded once. Not like someone who had won an argument, but like someone who had been expecting exactly that answer. He reached past Grace to take the small bag she had already packed, which told me Grace had made her own decision several minutes before I made mine. I followed him toward the back corridor. I did not know yet what he would tell me. I did not know what my father had seen in this man that made him worth 40 months of quiet vigilance and one very deliberate motorcycle. But I knew that whatever the story was, it had started long before the night I walked out of my own house. And I was already living somewhere inside the middle of it. The sedan Silas drove was the kind of car that disappears in traffic. Grey, mid-size, nothing that would hold anyone's attention for longer than the time it took to register and dismiss. The plates were Connecticut. I noticed that without asking about it, the same way I had noticed the specific knock pattern at Grace's back door. And the way he had checked the rear-view mirror 3 times in the first 2 blocks without appearing to do so. These were not accidents. Every detail about this man was chosen. I sat in the passenger seat with my small bag on my lap and watched Manhattan slide past the window in the thin early light. The city had that particular quality. It only gets between 5 and 7 in the morning. Not asleep. Not yet awake. Running on the skeletal crew of sanitation trucks and overnight nurses and people walking dogs in coats. Pulled tight against the cold. I had lived here for 11 years. And I had never felt more like a stranger to it than I did in that moment. I looked down at my left hand. The ring was gone. I had taken it off and left it on the windowsill at Grace's apartment before we walked out, a decision I had made without thinking much about it. The way you make the decisions that turn out to matter most. The skin where it had sat for 3 years was slightly paler. A faint impression in the shape of something that no longer existed. I closed my hand into a loose fist and turned to face Silas. Tell me about my father, I said. All of it. He drove for a moment without answering. Not evasion. More like the pause of someone deciding where the beginning actually is. Then he began. 10 years ago. He said he was a federal agent assigned to a financial crimes task force. Edward Sterling had been targeted by a sophisticated organized crime network that was using a series of shell companies to launder money through legitimate art acquisitions. Sterling Holdings was one of 3 firms they had identified as useful infrastructure. The operation required a protective detail embedded close enough to be effective. For 6 months, Silas had lived inside Edward's world. Same table at dinner. Same car. Same rooms where the real conversations happened and the real decisions were made. He was the most careful man I had ever worked with. Silas said careful in the way that people are careful when they have built something from nothing and they understand exactly how much can be lost. He paused and he was honest. Not the kind of honest that's easy. The kind that costs something. The case concluded. The network was prosecuted. Silas moved on to other assignments. He thought that was the end of it. 5 years later, Edward Sterling called him not to report a crime, not to request a favor, to ask for something that had no official category, the particular help that exists in the space between what institutions can do and what a person who trusts you completely needs done. Edward's health had been declining for 8 months by then. Faster than any of his doctors could fully explain. He had no proof. But he had spent 4 decades reading people and patterns in a world where misjudging either one could cost you everything. And his instincts were telling him that what was happening to his body was not entirely natural. Grant had been his son-in-law for 2 years. Edward had watched him the way he watched everything quietly over time, looking for the place where the surface didn't match what was underneath. He had found it. He couldn't go to the authorities, Silas said, not without evidence, and he knew that if he confronted Grant directly, Grant would simply accelerate whatever the plan already was. So, he did what careful people do when they're running out of time. He glanced at me briefly, then back at the road. He built something that couldn't be undone. The structure Edward created was an irrevocable trust established under Delaware law. The state, with the most sophisticated and protective trust statutes in the country under a Delaware irrevocable trust, once the document is signed and the assets transferred in, the person who created it cannot take it back, cannot change the terms, and cannot be pressured into dissolving it. It becomes its own legal entity governed entirely by the terms Edward had written and the trustee he had named to carry them out. That trustee was Silas. The trust held 40% of Sterling Holdings voting shares on the SEC filings and shareholder reports. The ownership was listed under the name Edward Sterling Family Trust, a legitimate designation that revealed nothing about who was actually making decisions on behalf of those shares. Grant knew the trust existed. He had seen it in the estate documents, but the identity of the trustee was protected under the confidentiality provisions Edward had built into the agreement. And without knowing who held that role, Grant had no way to locate pressure or remove the obstacle. More importantly, those 40% of voting shares carried a specific condition. Their full voting rights could only be formally activated by Caroline Sterling herself or by her authorized legal representative, which meant that every major financial decision Grant had made as acting head of Sterling Holdings over the past 3 years had been made without a valid shareholder quorum. Every acquisition, every restructuring, every contract above the threshold that required board approval, all of it potentially voidable, all of it waiting. I sat with that for a long moment. The car moved through an intersection, and outside the window, the sky above the East River had begun to change. The flat grey of early morning, giving way to something warmer along the horizon. The first suggestion of color before the actual light arrives. He knew. I said finally. It was not quite a question. He knew Grant was going to do this. Silas was quiet for 1 second. Not a long silence. Barely perceptible. But I had spent 11 years learning to read the difference between things that had been restored and things that were original. And the pause told me everything his words had not yet reached. Yes, he said. He knew. I turned back to the window. My father had sat across from Grant at dinners, at board meetings, at the quiet private occasions where families perform the rituals of being close. And he had known. He had said nothing to me because he understood that if I knew, I would confront Grant directly. And a direct confrontation with someone who was already planning 3 steps ahead would have ended only one way. So instead, he had built a wall around me that I could not see, and therefore could not inadvertently dismantle. He had trusted Silas with my life because he trusted me too much to put that weight on me before I was ready to carry it. The baby moved then. A slow, deliberate shift against my ribs. The first real movement I had felt since the night before. I pressed my palm flat against my side and felt the small, insistent pushback. Still here, I thought. Both of us. I had more questions. The pause Silas had taken before answering, barely a second, barely anything, told me there was still something I had not been given. Some piece of the story that had not yet found its moment. I could feel the shape of it the way I could feel the shape of a restoration gap in a piece of damaged lacquer. Not by seeing it directly, but by the way the surrounding surface behaved around its edge. I did not ask. Not yet. The sky was getting lighter and we were still moving. And some things I had learned were better approached when you were ready to hear the answer. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the car was the smell. Not exhaust. Not antiseptic. Not the particular mix of concrete and money that Manhattan exhales at every hour of the day and night. Just salt and cold air. And somewhere behind the low buildings at the end of the road, the sound of water moving against something solid, patient, unhurried, indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 72 hours. I stood on the gravel and I breathed. Actually breathed the way you forget how to do when your body has been running on adrenaline for 3 days straight. My lungs filled all the way to the bottom for the first time since I had stood in that hallway outside Grant's study and heard my name through a door that was not quite closed. My father had talked about a place like this. Retirement. He used to say, with the particular wistfulness of a man who knew he would never quite get there, somewhere small. Somewhere near the water. Somewhere that didn't require a calendar to function. He had set it at dinner tables and in car rides. And once I remembered now while standing in front of a 19th century Dutch seascape at a private showing, his hands clasped behind his back looking at painted water the way most people look at the real thing. He never got there. 40 years of building something that turned out to be worth fighting over had seemed to. And now here I was standing in a town so small it didn't have a traffic light. Arriving not in retirement, but in something that had no clean name. Yet doing it on his behalf. In a way neither of us would ever have chosen. The house Silas had arranged sat at the end of a short road that ran parallel to the shoreline. 2 bedrooms. A kitchen with a window above the sink that faced east. A front porch that would have been pleasant in warmer weather. The landlord was a man in his 70s who met us in the driveway with a key already in his hand and the manner of someone who had long ago decided that other people's business was not his business. He took the cash Silas counted out. Gave us the key. And told us the furnace ran a little loud on cold nights. That was the entire transaction. 3 days after we arrived, Silas sat me down at the kitchen table with 2 sets of documents. Caroline Carter and Daniel Thorne recently relocated from Boston. She was on maternity leave from a design firm. He did freelance consulting. Clean credit histories. No flags. No anomalies. The kind of paper trail that doesn't invite questions because there's nothing interesting enough to question. He had been building it for weeks. He said, since before that night. Which meant my father had asked him to prepare for a version of this long before I had any idea it was coming. I looked at the name on the documents. Caroline Carter. I said it once quietly just to hear what it sounded like in my own voice. Then I put the documents in the drawer under the kitchen counter and didn't think about them more than necessary. I started taking restoration work within the first 2 weeks. Commission sourced through an anonymous profile on a specialist platform. Payment routed through a holding account Silas set up under a business name that traced back to nothing useful. Small pieces at first. A water-damaged Gere-type frame. A pair of 19th century botanical prints with foxing along the edges. The kind of work that requires patience and a steady hand and absolute concentration. Which was exactly what I needed. Because concentration left no room for the other things. Maine in April is not a gentle place. The wind off the water was sharp enough to cut through anything I owned. The light was flat and pale for most of the day. And the town itself had the quiet particular to places where people have learned not to need much from outside. We were newcomers and we were treated with the mild undemanding friendliness that small coastal communities reserve for people who are not causing trouble and not planning to leave immediately. No one asked where we were from. No one asked why we were here. It was, I realized slowly, the first time in my adult life that no one knew who I was, and the anonymity felt less like hiding and more like breathing room. The contractions started at 2 in the morning 3 weeks after we arrived. I had been through enough false starts by then to know immediately that this was not one of them. I got up, went to the kitchen, stood at the sink with both hands on the counter, and breathed through the first wave. And then I called Grace. She picked up on the first ring. What followed was 14 hours that I will not pretend were easy or calm or anything other than exactly what they were. Grace had taken emergency personal leave from Manhattan General 3 days earlier. She had not told her supervisor why, only that it was a family matter, which was not entirely untrue. Grace's face on the laptop screen at the foot of the bed, her voice steady and professional, and occasionally shaking slightly at the edges in a way she probably didn't know I could see. Silas beside me the entire time, not talking, not offering the kind of reassurance that would have been meaningless anyway. Just there, a hand when I reached for one. A presence that the room needed and that I did not know until that moment how much I was relying on. You're doing fine. Grace said more than once. You're a terrible liar. I told her more than once. I know. She said. Keep going. So I kept going. Leo arrived just before 4 in the morning in a room that smelled like wood smoke and the sea. While the wind pressed against the windows and the furnace ran loud the way the landlord had warned us it would. He was small and furious and entirely himself from the first second, that particular absolute aliveness that newborns carry before the world has had any time to work on them. When he cried, I stopped hearing everything else. I looked up at some point. I don't know exactly when. And Silas was looking down at him with an expression I did not have a word for. Not surprise. Not the performative wonder that people put on in these moments. Something quieter than that and more permanent. The way a thing looks when it has just become true rather than when it is simply being observed. Grace said something from the laptop. I answered. At some point, the screen went dark and the room got quieter. Later, an hour, maybe 2. I had lost the threat of time entirely. I woke from a half sleep to find the bed beside me empty. I turned my head toward the window. Silas was standing with his back to me, Leo against his chest, looking out at the water. The sky outside was still dark, but along the edge of the horizon, there was the very first suggestion that somewhere far out, something was beginning to change. He stood completely still, the baby small against him, one large hand curved around Leo's back with a carefulness that had nothing practiced about it. I watched them for a moment without moving. Something shifted in my chest. Not dramatically. Not the way things shift in stories. Just a small, quiet movement. The way a door settles when the pressure on both sides finally equalizes. I didn't know what to call it. I was too tired to try. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the water carry me back under. 3 years is not a long time if you are living the life you planned. But if you are building one from scratch, if every morning requires a small deliberate act of deciding that this is real now, that the name on the mailbox is yours, that the child in the next room is the reason you keep going and not the thing that makes the weight heavier, then 3 years is not a span of time. It is a world. And like any world, it is made of small things almost entirely. Silas had told me in those first disorienting weeks at the house not to think about New York. Think about tomorrow morning. He said. Just that. At the time, I thought it was a simplistic thing to say to a woman who had lost her marriage, her home, her name, and her entire understanding of her own life within the span of a single night. I thought he was offering a platitude because he didn't have anything more useful to give. 3 years later, I understood that was not a comfort he was offering me. That was the mechanism he had used to survive his own years of working in places and situations that had no clean exits. One morning, then the next. Not because the larger picture doesn't matter, but because the larger picture will crush you if you try to hold it all at once. So, I learned to think about mornings. The mornings in Maine were particular things. Cold longer than felt reasonable. The light coming in low and sideways off the water. The smell of salt mixing with whatever Silas had already started on the stove before I came downstairs. He was without ceremony or announcement. A better cook than I was, which I discovered gradually, and pretended not to find as disarming as I did. He made coffee strong and eggs simple. And he always made enough for 3, even before Leo was old enough to eat at the table. As if he were practicing for the version of mornings that was coming. Leo came into himself the way children do. Faster than you think possible. And then suddenly, exactly as much as they always were going to be. By the time he was 2. He had opinions about everything. Which cup? Which story? Which side of the table? He had Silas's particular stillness when he was concentrating and something that was entirely his own when he was not. A kind of kinetic insistence on being noticed that filled whatever room he was in right to the edges. He started calling Silas Daddy Silas sometime around his 2nd birthday. There was no announcement. No moment of decision I could point to, it simply appeared. One morning. The way certain words appear in a child's vocabulary already settled, already load-bearing. No one had taught him that. No one had suggested it. And Silas, the first time he heard it, had looked at the boy for just a moment with that same expression I had seen in the dark on the night Leo was born. The one that had no performance in it at all. He never corrected it. Not once in all the time that followed. On weekday afternoons, when the light was still good and the wind had dropped to something manageable, Silas would take Leo out to the front porch with a small box of scrap wood pieces and squares of sandpaper in different grits. He had started it when Leo was barely old enough to hold anything with both hands. Some patient instinct in him, recognizing that the boy needed something to do with his hands to settle his mind. They would sit side by side on the porch steps. Leo with his tongue slightly out in concentration, working a block of pine in slow, careful strokes, the way Silas had shown him. And the sound of it, that soft, rhythmic whisper of paper against grain would come through the kitchen window while I was working. I would stop what I was doing and look out at them. What Leo was learning was patience. Not because anyone told him to be patient, but because the man sitting next to him was patience made physical, the kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't require acknowledgement. The kind that simply continues until the work is done. I had seen that quality in Silas on a wet highway when he had said exactly one word before losing consciousness. I recognized it differently now. Silas's right shoulder still bothered him when the temperature dropped. I knew because I had learned to read the particular way he held that side of himself on cold mornings. A slight tension across the trapezius. And sometimes when he thought he was unobserved, his left hand would come up and press briefly against the scar tissue beneath his shirt before dropping back to whatever he was doing. He never mentioned it. He never slowed down for it. I never asked. Some acknowledgements would have made him self-conscious. And self-consciousness was not something I wanted to give him. The November that Leo turned 2.5. He spiked a fever at bedtime that climbed to 104 by midnight. He cried in the sustained, exhausted way of small children who don't have the vocabulary for how bad they feel and can't understand why no one is fixing it. Silas sat on the edge of Leo's mattress and told stories, his voice already going rough with sleeplessness. And every 15 minutes, without fail, he replaced the damp cloth on Leo's forehead with a cooler one, with the same methodical reliability he brought to everything else. I sat in the doorway. I didn't go in. I wasn't sure in that moment that the room needed me. Near 4 in the morning, Leo finally went still. His breathing smoothed out and his small fists unclenched, and the room settled into the kind of quiet that only comes after a long effort. Silas stayed where he was. I stayed in the doorway. We didn't talk. There are things that don't require definition because they define themselves over time quietly through accumulation. I understood that sitting in that doorway in the dark on the afternoon of Leo's 3rd birthday. He came running in from the porch and grabbed Silas around the knees with the full body commitment of a child who has no concept of restraint. He looked up at him with absolute seriousness. "Daddy Silas," he said, "will you always be here?" Silas went very still. He looked down at Leo for a long moment. Not the pause of someone searching for the right answer, but the pause of someone making sure they mean what they are about to say. "Always, buddy," he said. Leo accepted this with the complete satisfaction of someone who had never doubted it and merely needed confirmation. He let go of Silas's knees and went back to the porch. I was standing at the kitchen doorway. I had heard every word. I stayed where I was until I was sure my face was settled. And then I went back to the piece I had been working on. A small oil painting, 19th century, with a hairline crack running through the lower third that needed weeks of careful filling before it would be stable enough for the next stage. Patient work. Slow work. The kind that asks you to trust the process even when you can't see the result yet. That evening, after Leo was asleep, I sat alone on the porch with a blanket over my shoulders and listened to the water. The town was dark and quiet. The sky had more stars than I had ever seen growing up in Manhattan. And I had stopped being surprised by that months ago. Which meant I was more at home here than I had ever consciously decided to be. The quiet was real. But underneath it, faint like a note held too long, there was the thing I had not let myself look at directly. The life I had left was still there. Grant was still there. The trust. The evidence. The years my father had spent preparing a defense I hadn't had to use yet. None of that had gone away simply because I had found somewhere peaceful enough to breathe. I had been thinking about tomorrow morning for 3 years. I understood sitting there with the sound of the water and the stars and my son asleep inside that tomorrow morning was almost here. That morning began the way every morning in Maine had begun for 3 years. Coffee first because nothing happened before coffee. Then Leo's voice from outside. He had taken to spending the first 20 minutes after breakfast in the backyard regardless of the temperature, conducting some private investigation of the shoreline that he had never fully explained and that I had learned not to interrupt. The March light came through the kitchen window at its usual shallow angle. Pale and watery, not yet strong enough to be called warm. I had a 19th century pocket watch disassembled on the worked in front of me. 7 mainspring components and a balance wheel the size of a shirt button laid out on a square of velvet in the order I had removed them. I was leaning in close with my loupe checking the pivot holes for wear when my phone lit up beside me. A push notification from one of the art news platforms I had followed anonymously for years. The kind of account that tracked private sales and high-end auction events. I almost didn't tap it. I was mid-examination and the pivot hole in question was not going to assess itself. I tapped it. The headline was 14 words. I read them once and then I read them again slowly. The way you reread something when your first reading has told you something your brain is not yet willing to confirm. Grant Vain to feature sterling family heirloom at April charity auction. First public appearance of the iconic Dawn sterling vase. There was a photograph beneath the headline. The vase was displayed on a lit pedestal shot from a 3/4 angle. The celadon glaze catching the studio light the way old porcelain does, with depth rather than surface shine. The article described it as a family treasure. A 19th century Chinese export piece with documented provenance through 4 generations of the Sterling family, being offered for the first time in a public venue as the centerpiece of a benefit auction for the Vain Foundation. It also noted in the second paragraph that Caroline Sterling, the last documented heir of the Sterling family and the vase's most recent custodian, had been missing for 3 years following an unresolved automobile accident. Grant Vain was described as the current acting steward of the Sterling estate. I put the phone down. Then I picked it up again and looked at the photograph for a long time. My father had acquired the Dawn sterling vase when I was 12 years old. A private purchase from an estate sale in Connecticut. A piece that had been in poor condition and had sat in his office for 2 years before he decided it was ready to be properly restored. He gave it to me as my first serious restoration project when I was 23. 8 years after he had bought it. I spent 6 months on it. I learned more from that one piece than from any course I had taken or any text I had read about celadon glazing, about export period construction methods, about the particular way temperature stress fractures in high-fired porcelain differ from impact fractures and require a completely different filling approach, and at the very base of the piece, in an area that would be invisible when the vase was displayed on a pedestal, I had made a small repair to a hairline stress fracture using a tinted consolidant. I had mixed myself a color that was close to the original, but not quite perfect. A slight warmth in the gray that no one who had not examined that specific section of the original would ever know to look for. I had documented the repair in my personal records. Not in the formal provenance file. Not in any record that would have been accessible to anyone working from photographs or secondary documentation. The vase in the photograph did not have that repair. The glaze at the base was smooth and uniform and exactly the color the original glaze would have been before I touched it, which meant that whoever had made this piece had worked from photographs or from the provenance documentation or from access to the vase before I restored it. They were good. Exceptionally good. In fact, the proportions were accurate. The firing quality was high, and the surface aging treatment was sophisticated enough that most collectors would never have questioned it. But they had not had the original to reference. And I had. I stood up from the table. I walked to the back of the house to the smaller room I used as a workspace, where a wooden box sat on the shelf above my restoration supplies. Latched. Unassuming. The kind of box that does not invite examination. I had taken it from the glass display case in the hallway of the Sterling estate on the night I left, a decision made in the same automatic preconscious way that I had made several decisions that night. I had not examined it in 3 years. I had simply moved it from place to place and kept it latched. The way you keep something that is not ready yet. I opened it now. The vase was wrapped in archival tissue. Through the same tissue I had packed it in 3 years ago. I lifted it out carefully, turned it over in my hands and looked at the base. The repair was there. That slight warmth in the gray. The almost but not quite of a color I had mixed in a small studio apartment on a Tuesday afternoon when I was 23 years old and learning what patience actually required. I held it for a moment. Then I carried it back to the kitchen. Silas was at the counter when I came in. He had heard Leo come inside and was making the second round of coffee that Leo's morning energy levels made necessary. I set the phone on the table in front of him without speaking and waited while he read. He was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then he looked up. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I had been standing at the kitchen window looking at the water while he read. And I had been asking myself the same question. 3 years ago. I had left because staying would have killed me. I had built something here that was real. The boy in the next room. The morning routines. The salt air and the pocket watches and the 2 cups of coffee and all of it. None of that disappeared because of a photograph in a news article. But my father had spent the last years of his life building a wall around something he believed was worth protecting. Not just the company. Not just the assets. The truth about what had been done to him and the tool to make it matter. That tool was sitting in a wooden box on my kitchen table. I thought about what my father had said about restoration. Not about making things look new, but about understanding why they were made to last. I had always thought he meant the objects. Standing in that kitchen in March 2024. I understood he had meant something else entirely. I turned from the window and looked at Silas. "I think it's time to go back," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the box. Then back at me. "Then we plan it right," he said. "No mistakes." I nodded. Outside, Leo was asking from the other room whether sandpaper worked on seashells. Silas called back that they'd find out after lunch. The morning continued in all its ordinary ways. Coffee going warm, light shifting on the water. A child's voice moving through a house that had become against all odds a home. But something in the room had changed. Something that felt after 3 years of careful stillness like the first movement of a thing that had been wound tight for a very long time. Before I tell you what Silas found out about my father, the thing that broke me and rebuilt me at the same time, I need to know you're still with me. Drop "I knew it" in the comments if you already felt something was wrong from the very beginning. Note the story ahead contains fictional elements crafted for educational purposes. Some of what I'm about to say is hard to hear. If you need to step away, this is a good place to pause. I used to think revenge was a single thing. A moment. A confrontation. A door slamming shut on everything that had been done to you. I understood now that justice, real justice, the kind that holds, is not a moment. It is a structure. It requires evidence gathered correctly, time spent without shortcuts and the right people in the right positions when the last piece falls into place. Revenge is personal. Justice is architectural. And for the first time in 3 years, I had the materials to build something that would stand. Silas and I worked for 2 full days at the kitchen table. He watched me spread the first sheet of notes across the surface, a habit I had developed in restoration work. Mapping the damage before touching anything. Understanding the full scope before committing to the first repair. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly that I planned the same way my father had run board meetings. I took that as the highest compliment either of them could have given me. And I kept writing. The plan had 2 parts entirely separate designed to function independently but land simultaneously. The first part was the vase. The Don Sterling vase. The real one. The one with the repair at the base that no forger had known to replicate would be shipped to the Sabes venue through a licensed fine art transport company with full insurance documentation. It would arrive as a competing lot submitted by an anonymous restoration expert with verifiable credentials accompanied by a signed authentication certificate detailing the specific technical markers that distinguished it from the piece Grant was selling. The certificate would be written in the precise measured language of expert witness testimony because that was exactly what it was going to become. The moment the 2 pieces were placed in proximity at the venue, any qualified appraiser in the room would see the discrepancy within minutes. Grant would be attempting to sell a forgery in front of collectors, journalists, and industry professionals, under federal law. Specifically, the statutes governing wire fraud and interstate art transactions that constituted a criminal act with a paper trail already attached to it. That was the public layer. the visible one. The second part required a phone. Silas placed a call to Robert Hale through a line I had not known existed. Encrypted, routed through a relay Silas had maintained since the first months in Maine. The kind of communication infrastructure that federal agencies use when they don't want a record appearing in standard logs. Hale's voice came through clearly despite the distance and the precautions. The same unhurried cadence I had first heard in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning 3 years ago. He began with the evidence. In the 2 years following our departure from Manhattan, Hale had been working quietly through channels that Grant's network could not easily monitor to build a forensic case against Grant Vane for the death of Edward Sterling. The process had required a court-ordered independent laboratory analysis of biological material from Edward's autopsy. A process that could not be rushed without compromising the chain of custody that would be required to admit the findings in a federal proceeding. Chain of custody meant that every sample, every result, every transfer of material had to be documented and verifiable at every step. One gap in that chain, and a competent defense attorney would have the findings excluded before they reached a jury. The analysis had been completed 11 weeks ago. Hale read the conclusion in the same tone he might have used to relay the terms of a contract amendment. The findings indicated the presence of a compound in Edward Sterling's tissue samples, consistent with a class of substances that accumulate gradually in the renal system over a period of weeks to months. The compound was colorless, odorless, and metabolized in a manner that without targeted forensic analysis would present clinically as progressive renal failure of apparent natural origin. The concentration found in the samples was inconsistent with environmental exposure or accidental ingestion. The timeline of accumulation reconstructed from the available biological material placed the introduction of the compound at approximately 6 months before Edward Sterling's death. I had to sit down. I was already sitting technically, but there is a difference between sitting and needing to sit. And somewhere in the middle of that paragraph, I crossed from one to the other. I placed both hands flat on the table. I did not look at Silas. I looked at the grain of the wood and I listened to Hale finish speaking. When the line was quiet, I said, "He killed my father." It was not a question. Silas said, "The evidence is strong enough to support a federal investigation." Hale has been in contact with the FBI field office in New York for the past month. They are prepared to move, but they want to do it at the auction. Maximum witnesses, maximum documented impact, minimum opportunity for Grant to access and destroy anything before the arrest is executed. I thought about that. A public arrest in front of the people Grant had spent years cultivating. Collectors, donors, business partners, the journalists who covered philanthropic events in this city and would have no choice but to report what they saw. No private conversation in a lawyer's office that could later be characterized as a misunderstanding. No opportunity to shift the narrative before it had already been witnessed by 100 people and recorded by a dozen cameras. My father had been a patient man. He had built Sterling Holdings over 4 decades through exactly that kind of structural thinking. Never the fastest move, always the right one. Then that's when we do it, I said. 3 days before the auction, Hale filed the complete evidentiary package with the FBI field office and the Office of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. The submission included the forensic toxicology findings, the chain of custody documentation, the financial records demonstrating Grant's systematic misuse of Sterling Holdings assets, and the trust instrument establishing Silas's role as trustee of the 40% voting bloc Grant had been treating as his own for 3 years. The FBI confirmed receipt. A federal arrest warrant was prepared and held awaiting execution at the venue. That evening, after Leo was asleep and the house had gone quiet, I went into the workroom alone. The wooden box was on the shelf where it always was. I didn't open it. I simply put my hand on top of it and stood there in the dark for a while, feeling the grain of the wood under my palm, the same way I had learned to feel the surface of a damaged piece before beginning work. Trying to understand what was underneath before committing to the first touch. My father had known. He had known what Grant was, and he had known what Grant would do. And he had spent his remaining time building something that could outlast him. He had trusted Silas to hold it. He had trusted me to use it when the moment came. The moment was in 4 days. I took my hand off the box. I turned off the light. I walked down the hall. Checked on Leo once. Asleep on his back. One arm flung wide. The complete unconscious confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt the safety of the place he sleeps. And then I went to bed. Tomorrow the planning was done. What came next was something else. The last time I left Maine, it was past midnight in the back of an ambulance with no idea where I was going. This time I left in the morning. The sun was still low when Silas pulled out of the gravel driveway, that particular early April light that hasn't decided yet whether it intends to be warm. Leo was asleep in the back seat before we reached the main road. His head tilted against the window. One hand wrapped around the small wooden car Silas had helped him sand smooth on the porch steps 8 months ago. I watched him in the side mirror for a moment, the complete absolute stillness of a sleeping child, and then I turned forward and watched the road instead. I had spent 3 years in Maine not looking back at New York. This morning I was driving toward it, and the distance between those two facts was the entire shape of who I had become in between. I looked at Silas's hands on the wheel. His right shoulder, the one that still held weather in the scar tissue, the one he pressed briefly with his left hand on cold mornings when he thought no one was watching, was relaxed now. Easy. The posture of someone who has made peace with long drives. I thought about the night I had first seen him on a wet highway, face down on the asphalt. A stranger I had no reason to stop for. I had not known his name. I had not known anything about him except that he was bleeding and in the path of oncoming traffic, and that I could not keep driving. Now he was taking me back to the city that had tried to take everything from me. And he drove with the same steadiness he brought to every other thing, as if the destination were simply the next part of a plan that had always been sound. Leo woke up somewhere past Portland, blinking and immediately curious in the way of children who never waste the first minutes of consciousness on confusion. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at a highway overpass. "A bridge," Silas said. "Cars drive over it so they don't have to go around." "What's that?" "A rest stop. We can stretch our legs there in a little while." "What's that?" "That is a very large truck carrying, based on the logo, probably paper products." "What's paper products?" "Things made of paper. Napkins. Cardboard. Possibly the boxes your cereal comes in." Leo considered this with great seriousness, then moved on to the next thing visible through the glass. I sat listening to them and felt the particular kind of ache that comes from something being almost unbearably ordinary in the middle of circumstances that were anything but. This was the sound of a Tuesday morning in any family's car on any road. A child asking questions that had no bottom to them. An adult answering without impatience the miles going past. And in approximately 32 hours, I was going to walk into a room full of people who believed I was dead. But not yet. For now. There was the road and the overpass and the large truck, probably carrying paper products. We stopped at a rest area somewhere in Massachusetts, at a low brick building with a food court and a small outdoor play area fenced in blue plastic. Leo went directly to the climbing structure with the focused intensity of someone who had been saving energy for exactly this. Silas stood beside me at the fence, both of us watching him navigate a rope ladder with his tongue slightly out in concentration. After a moment, Silas said without turning toward me, "You don't have to go in alone. You never did." I looked at him. He was still watching Leo. I had spent 3 years building careful words around difficult things. I had developed a facility for measured responses for the kind of language that does not give more than the situation requires. But standing at a rest stop fence in Massachusetts with the spring wind pulling at my coat and my son working his way across a rope bridge with the absolute confidence of a 3-year-old, I did not have a careful response ready. I nodded. He nodded back, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. We reached Brooklyn at 7 in the evening. The hotel was small and unremarkable, which was exactly what we needed. The kind of place that processed cash payments without visible curiosity, and kept its hallways quiet. After 9, we checked in under names that matched the documents Silas had maintained since Maine. Leo was asleep again before his shoes came off. One arm flung wide across the pillow in his standard posture of complete unconscious confidence. I stood at the window after Silas had settled into the chair by the door. A position I had noticed he always chose. Back to the wall. Clear sightline to the entry point. Not a habit, but a reflex so embedded it had become invisible. Outside across the water, Manhattan's skyline was lit against the dark sky. I had not seen it from this angle in 3 years. It looked the same. Of course it did. Cities do not change their silhouettes for the people who have been away from them. The lights were in the same places. The towers the same heights. The bridges the same arcs of pale light over dark water. But I was not the same person who had last seen it. I stood there and took a full inventory of what I felt the way I had been trained to take inventory of a damaged piece before beginning work. There was weight. There was something that might have been grief or might have been the residue of it. The place where grief had been and was now mostly scar tissue. There was the particular alertness of someone who has been still for a long time and is now required to move. What there was not, I realized, was fear. Not the kind I had carried out of that house 3 years ago. Damp and shapeless and too large to see around. That was gone. What had replaced it was something cleaner and considerably more useful. The encrypted phone buzzed on the nightstand. Hale's voice was precise and brief. The vase had arrived safely at the venue and had been examined by 3 independent appraisers. All 3 had confirmed its authenticity. Grant's team had been attempting for the past 6 hours to determine its origin and had not succeeded. The FBI unit was in position. The operation would proceed at 7:00 p.m. the following evening. "Thank you," I said. "Get some sleep." Hale said. "Tomorrow requires you at your best." I put the phone down and looked across the room at Silas, who was watching me with the quiet attention he had been giving me since the night we met. Measuring steady. Not intrusive. 7:00 p.m. I said. He nodded once. I did not sleep for a long time that night. But I want to be precise about why, because it matters. It was not fear keeping me awake. It was not doubt and it was not dread. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something that has been a long time coming, the last moment before you place the final piece. When the work is almost done. And the completion of it is so close. You can feel it in your hands before you've touched it. I lay in the dark. And I waited for morning. Morning had come the way mornings always do. Without ceremony. Without waiting to be told it was allowed. We had spent the day in the hotel room. The 3 of us. Leo had discovered that the carpet near the window was an acceptable surface for his wooden car. And he drove it in careful loops around an imaginary track while Silas went through the operational details one last time, and I sat at the small desk and did not think about anything I could not control. At 4:00, Grace arrived from across the city. She had taken the day off, told no one, and walked through the hotel door with 2 paper cups of coffee and the expression of someone who has decided that being useful is the only acceptable response to being afraid. She stayed with Leo. Silas and I left at 6. The car was parked 1 block from the venue. From the passenger seat, I could see the entrance to Sabes Manhattan directly. The canopy. The attendants in dark jackets. The slow procession of guests arriving in cars that cost more than most people's annual income. Crystal chandeliers visible through the tall windows. White tablecloths. The particular choreography of a high-end charitable event where generosity and visibility are always performing for each other. 3 years ago, I had attended evenings like this one as a matter of course. I had known the protocols. Which rooms opened first. Which conversations happened at the bar versus at the table. When to circulate. And when to hold position. I had known how to exist in that world. Because I had been raised in it. Shaped by it. Handed my place in it at birth. Tonight, I was outside it. In a dark coat. In a parked car. Watching it through glass. Silas opened the laptop on the console between us. The feed from the FBI's for interior cameras came up in a split-screen grid. The main hall. The entrance corridor. The podium area. And the side room where the lots were staged before presentation. The image quality was clear enough that I could read the printed placards on the display stands. On the central podium, under a focused, warm spotlight sat the vase, even on a laptop screen through a security camera's slightly flattened perspective. It was convincing. The celadon glaze caught the light with that particular depth that had taken me 6 months and significant failure to understand when I was 23. Whoever had made it was genuinely skilled. I looked at the base of the displayed piece. The camera angle didn't show it clearly. But I already knew what wasn't there. I was in this entire room full of people who collected and traded and staked their reputations on knowing the real from the false. The only person who had touched the original with her own hands. The weight of that knowledge settled over me not heavily. Not the way I might have expected. More like a cloak than a burden. Silas's phone buzzed. He read it and said, "Hale is in position." He says, "Grant arrived 8 minutes ago. East entrance." I looked at the entrance feed. Grant walked across the screen in the navy suit he favored for evening events. I recognized it immediately, the particular shade, and cut the way it sat on his shoulders. He moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who has spent years treating every room as an audience. People turned as he passed. He shook hands, inclined his head, smiled at the right moments and in the right proportions. He was, I had to acknowledge, very good at this. He had always been very good at this. I watched him and waited for something to break open in my chest. Nothing did. What I felt was closer to the focused stillness I entered when beginning work on a difficult piece. The part where all the preparation has been done. And what remains is execution. Grant crossed the camera frame and disappeared toward the main hall. And I exhaled slowly and realized my hands were flat and open on my knees rather than clenched. Then I saw Serafina. She came in 30 seconds behind Grant through the same entrance. Wearing a deep green dress that I would have said suited her once. She looked thinner than I remembered. The color in her face was different. Not the high energy she had always carried. That particular brightness that had made her the one everyone gravitated toward at family gatherings when we were young. Something in it had gone quiet in the years since I had last seen her. She moved through the entrance corridor with the manner of someone attending an obligation rather than an event. Her eyes scanned the room in the mechanical way of someone who is not looking for anything pleasant. For one moment, the camera caught her face in full, and I saw something there I had not allowed myself to expect. She was not happy, not performing unhappiness, not arranging her expression for effect. She simply was not happy in the way that a person who has been making a specific mistake for a long time starts to carry it in the set of their face. I thought of my sister at 12 years old sitting on the floor outside our father's study with her knees pulled to her chest because she had been left out of something and hadn't wanted to say so directly. She had always been the one who needed to be included and never knew how to ask for it. I had known that about her and I had not done enough with the knowledge, and I was not sure what to do with that understanding now sitting in a car outside a building where the consequences of everything were about to arrive. The auction began at 7 o'clock precisely. Grant took the microphone with the unhurried confidence of someone who is rehearsed without appearing to have rehearsed. He spoke about the Sterling family legacy, Edward Sterling's vision, the role of the Dawn vase as a symbol of continuity between generations, the privilege of being its steward in this moment. He was eloquent. He was composed. He was by any visible measure completely in control of the room. I sat in the car 1 block away and held the encrypted phone in my hand and did not look away from the screen. Silas said quietly, "You okay?" I thought about it for a genuine moment rather than answering reflexively. My hands were still. My breathing was even. The thing in my chest that had been wound tight since the night in Maine, when I had first seen the news article, had not loosened it, had simply clarified, sharpened into something with a specific shape and a specific purpose. "Yes," I said. And I meant it in a way I had not expected to mean it. The message from Hale came through at 7:14. Vase on the podium confirmed forgery by FBI engaged appraisers. Full documentation submitted to case file. All units in position. Awaiting confirmation to proceed. I looked at Silas. He looked at me. No speech. No last-minute deliberation. 3 years of evidence. 2 years of chain of custody. A vase that knew what it was. Sitting in a room full of people who were about to find out. I typed 1 word into the encrypted phone and sent it to Hale. Now I sent the word and then I watched the screen inside the auction hall. The large format display behind the podium, the one that had been cycling through catalog images of the evening's lots, went dark for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for the room to notice. Not long enough for anyone to react. Then it came back on. What appeared was not a photograph of a vase. The FBI had taken control of Saab's AV system 40 minutes earlier through a technician on their team who had been credentialed into the event setup crew 3 days before. The legal authority to do so had been part of the warrant package filed with the Southern District, a controlled presentation of evidence at the moment of maximum witness density. Everything that appeared on that screen had already been submitted to the case file. Every document was stamped. Every timestamp was verified. What the room was about to see was not a surprise to the federal prosecutors. It was a performance of something that was already legally done. The first document was an email chain Grant Vane to a logistics contractor subject line transportation arrangement March. The dates aligned precisely with the night on the highway. The language was careful in the way that language is careful when someone believes they are being clever, indirect enough to allow for interpretation, specific enough to be functional. The final message in the chain included a figure, a number with several digits that represented the cost of a truck, a driver, and a stretch of wet road at 1 in the morning. The second document was a wire transfer record, same contractor, same amount, originating account, a subsidiary of Vane Capital Holdings. The third was the forensic toxicology report, the laboratory seal of the independent testing facility. The chain of custody signature log showing every hand the material had passed through from the medical examiner's archive to the federal evidence locker. And at the bottom in the clipped unambiguous language of expert forensic testimony, findings consistent with intentional administration of a nephrotoxic compound over a period of approximately 6 months prior to the subject's death. The subject was Edward Sterling. The room held its silence for 3 full seconds. I counted them on the laptop screen watching the feed. 300 people in formal dress, standing or seated, all of them looking at the same display and arriving at the same understanding at slightly different speeds. Then the silence broke. The way silence always breaks when it has been holding something too large. Not gradually, but all at once. Grant moved before the sound had fully risen. He did not panic. That was the thing I remember most clearly. Even now, watching through the camera feed at a slight downward angle, I could see that he did not panic. He walked to the microphone with the same unhurried confidence he had used 20 minutes earlier when he was speaking about legacy and stewardship. And he reached it before the first FBI agent had cleared the main entrance. His voice carried over the rising noise of the room with the precision of a man who has rehearsed for exactly this contingency. "This woman," he said, and his hand extended toward Sarafina across the floor. "Sarafina Sterling. She approached me 18 months ago with a plan. The forgery, the paperwork, all of it. She came to me. I had no knowledge of the vase's authenticity. I was deceived the same as everyone in this room." I watched Sarafina's face on the screen. The color left it so completely and so fast that for a moment I thought the camera feed had lost saturation. She stood where she was, completely still, looking at Grant with an expression I recognized, even through the compressed image of a security camera, because it was the expression of someone hearing a lie so complete and so deliberately aimed that the mind takes a moment to confirm what the body already knows. He had prepared her as his exit. She had always been his exit. Then she reached into her bag. The phone she pulled out was small. She had been carrying that recording for 8 months. Not as a weapon. Not as a plan. But the way certain people carry the one piece of evidence that proves they are not entirely wrong about their own life. She had never intended to use it in public. But Grant had just said her name out loud in front of 300 people. And some decisions make themselves. She held it up, the gesture of someone who has run out of reasons to stay quiet. She crossed the 3 steps to the nearest table microphone, set the phone beside it, and pressed play. I thought about when she must have made it some evening when she had finally understood, perhaps before I did, that Grant was not a man who kept people once they stopped being useful. She had recorded him the way people record things they hope they will never need, quietly without a plan, as proof that she was not entirely wrong about her own life. Grant's voice came out of the phone speaker, amplified through the table microphone into the hall system. It was not a long recording. It did not need to be. His voice in the recording had none of the public F-facing quality he had used at the podium. It was the voice I had heard once through a study door lower, faster, stripped of the performance layer. He described the truck arrangement in terms that left no interpretive room. He named the driver by the contractor's reference code. He described knowing the morning after the highway accident that the car registered to Caroline Sterling had been found abandoned and damaged near the scene and that no body had been recovered. And he described in the particular phrasing of someone explaining their own reasoning why he had chosen not to pursue the question further. The plan, he said in the recording, had achieved its purpose regardless. Sarafina lifted her hand from the phone and stepped back from the table. She did not look at Grant. She looked at the floor in front of her own feet with the posture of someone who has just set down something very heavy and is not sure yet what the absence of it feels like. I realized my face was wet. I did not know when it had started. I became aware of it the way you become aware of weather. Not at its beginning, but at the point when it has already been happening long enough to be undeniable. I was not crying about Grant. I had processed Grant a long time ago in increments across 3 years of mornings in a small house that smelled like salt and would smoke. What I was crying about was my sister standing in a room full of people who were all looking at her, having just destroyed the only protection she had thought she had, because the man she had protected had said her name out loud and aimed the room at her. She was 30 years old, and she still didn't know how to ask for what she needed. Some things do not change. Silas's hand came down on my shoulder. Not heavily. Just enough to be present. "It's time," he said. I looked at the screen one more moment. The FBI agents were moving through the main entrance now in the organized, unhurried way of people executing a plan that has been rehearsed. Grant had stopped speaking. The room was a controlled chaos of movement and sound and people reaching for phones and each other. I nodded. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The April air was cool and immediate against my face. The city noise, traffic voices, the low ambient hum of 10,000 things happening simultaneously came back all at once after the sealed quiet of the car. I stood on the pavement for exactly one breath, feeling the concrete solid under my feet for the first time in 3 years on this specific island. Then I straightened my coat and I walked toward the entrance. I had imagined this moment many times across 3 years. In dreams. Usually the kind that leave a residue on the morning. A mood you carry into the first cup of coffee without quite knowing why. Sometimes in the afternoons in Maine, sitting on the porch with the water in front of me. And the specific quality of light that comes just before sunset when everything goes amber and the day gets quiet. In those imaginings, I had been afraid or angry or brittle with something I could not name cleanly. What I had not imagined was this pushing open the door of a room full of people and feeling underneath everything else completely still. The noise hit first, not the structured noise of an event in progress, but the particular dissonance of a large room that has lost its script. Voices overlapping the scrape of chairs, the collective sound of 300 people trying to understand the same thing simultaneously. Under the chandeliers, in the warm light that had been designed to make objects look their most beautiful and their most valuable. The room looked exactly as I remembered it, and nothing like I remembered it at all. I walked in. I did not look for Grant immediately. I looked straight ahead the way you walk through a difficult restoration, not fixed on the damage but on the through line. The structural element that tells you where you are and where you need to get to. My heels on the marble floor. The distance between me and the center of the room. One step then the next. The sound changed as people saw me, not all at once in clusters. Recognition spreading outward like water disturbed at its center. I heard my name or I heard the intake of breath that precedes a name and I kept walking. Robert Hale was already moving. He had been positioned near the side of the hall close to the venue's fixed microphone stand, the one used for announcements separate from the podium. He reached it before Grant had fully processed what he was seeing. I watched Hale's hand close around the microphone stand with the unhurried competence of a man who has been preparing for this specific moment for considerably longer than tonight. His voice went out across the room at full volume. Caroline Sterling is alive and present in this hall. Her identity has been confirmed through federal biometric records, fingerprint and identification documentation cross-referenced against bureau databases as part of the ongoing federal investigation. She is the surviving heir and beneficiary of the Edward Sterling estate and she is here in her full legal capacity. Grant had stopped. He stood perhaps 30 feet from me and I watched his face go through the calculation. Not panic. Not the open shock of someone who has been genuinely surprised. The calculation of someone assessing which of his prepared responses still applied. For one moment, I could see him arriving at the conclusion that he could still frame this. Still reach the microphone and recast the narrative before enough people had decided what they were looking at. He took one step toward the podium. Hale's voice continued without pause, without inflection. Furthermore, the Edward Sterling Family Trust is now formally activated tonight with Caroline Sterling present as beneficiary and Silas Thorne confirmed as trustee. The legal consequences for Sterling Corporation's governance over the past 3 years will be addressed through the appropriate proceedings. Those details are already with the court. The room had gone very quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has shifted that cannot be unshifted. Grant turned and looked at me directly. I had wondered across 3 years what this moment would feel like. Whether I would feel the satisfaction I had told myself I would feel or whether I would feel something else. Something smaller or stranger or harder to account for. I had not let myself answer the question because I had not known if I would ever stand here to find out. What I felt looking at Grant Vane across 30 feet of marble floor in a room that was no longer his, was very nearly nothing. Not numbness. I want to be precise about that. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something that had been processed so thoroughly it had lost its heat. I had been angry at this man. I had been afraid of him and hurt by him. And I had lain awake in a house that smelled like salt and thought about what I would say when this day came. And now it was here. And what I had to offer him was the calm of someone who has walked through a fire long enough to stop being surprised by the temperature. I met his eyes. And I held them. And I did not look away. He was the first to move. I do not think it was rational. I do not think in that moment that Grant Vane was operating from the strategic intelligence that had guided everything he had done for 3 years. I think what moved him was simpler and older than strategy. The instinct of a man who has always resolved problems by advancing on them, who has never in his adult life been in a room where there was no move left to make, and has therefore not yet accepted that this is that room. He walked toward me. Silas stepped forward from my left. He did not speak. He did not raise his hands. He simply moved to the position between Grant and me and stopped there. And there was something in the way he stood, not aggressive, not threatening, just absolutely and completely immovable, that made the word obstacle inadequate. He was not an obstacle. He was the end of the option. Grant stopped. He looked at Silas. Silas looked at him with the steady, untroubled attention of someone who has been in much worse rooms than this and has not yet found a situation that required him to raise his voice. The 3 seconds that followed were the longest I can remember standing still. Then the 2 FBI agents came in from Grant's left and right simultaneously, the practiced geometry of people who have rehearsed this exact approach for exactly this body type and this stance. One agent's hand went to Grant's right arm. The other agent spoke clearly at a volume calibrated for the room. Grant Vane. You are under arrest. The rest was procedure. Rights read clearly. Hands secured efficiently. Movement toward the exit with the particular quiet authority that federal agents carry when they are not in a hurry because they do not need to be. The room watched. Every phone in the room was already recording. I stood where I was. Silas came to stand beside me. Not in front of me anymore. Just beside. He did not say anything. I did not say anything. We watched Grant Vane walk out of the room he had spent 3 years treating as his own. And the only sound I made was a single slow exhale that I had been holding. I realized since the moment I walked through the door. The room did not empty when the handcuffs went on. 300 people who had come for a charity auction stood in collective suspension. Not yet sure whether the event was over or merely pausing. I stood in the middle of it and felt strangely like the quietest point in the room. The storm had passed. The air hadn't filled in yet. I had spent 3 years deciding that the question of how much of Grant's performance had been real was not the right question. The right question had always been what I was going to do about what was true. Now, the room around me was the answer to that question. Grant was being moved toward the main exit. 2 agents. 1 on each side. The practiced formation of people who do this without drama. Because drama is not the point. The point is the door. He stopped before he reached it. He turned and looked back at the room at me. And what came out of him was not a legal argument. It was crudder than that. And aimed more precisely. He raised his voice. "The boy," he said. And the hall went quiet again. "Leo. He's mine. She knows he's mine. And she's been keeping him from me. I had a test done." He reached inside his jacket with his free hand and produced a folded document. A man who had come here tonight with contingencies already in his pocket. "DNA results," he said. "Independent lab. Mr. Vane." Silas's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room found the silence for it without being asked. He set an envelope on the nearest table. Not thrown down. Not presented with theatre placed. The way you set something down that has already done its work before anyone opens it. "The test you're holding has no documented chain of custody." Silas said the sample source for the child is unverified. The laboratory is not federally certified for evidentiary proceedings. Under the federal rules of evidence, that document is not admissible in any proceeding that will matter. One beat. The envelope on this table contains results from an AABB-accredited independent laboratory conducted under court-supervised protocol with full chain of custody documentation already filed with the Southern District. Every step of that process is verifiable and admissible. It confirms Leo's biological paternity and will be entered into the court record. He looked at Grant without contempt. Without satisfaction. Just clarity. The court will decide what comes next. Not you. Grant looked at the envelope. Then at Silas. Then at me. Whatever he was searching for in my face. Some crack. Some tremor. Evidence that the word Leo had landed the way he intended. He did not find it. I was thinking about my son asleep in a hotel room in Brooklyn. His wooden car tucked under his arm. Grace in the chair by the door. The thought was not frightening. It was simply true. And true things have a steadiness that performed things never achieve. The agents moved Grant toward the exit. He did not look back a second time. The room exhaled. I felt it as a physical change in pressure. Hundreds of people releasing something they had been holding for 20 minutes. Silas turned from the table and looked at me. "You okay?" The last time he had asked me that, I had been in the back of an ambulance 8½ months pregnant with blood on my hands that wasn't mine. I had nodded because nodding was what I had. This time I looked at him. Really looked the way you look at someone when you are not managing the moment but actually in it. "Yes," I said, "I actually am." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of someone who has confirmed a thing and is ready to move forward. I looked around the hall. Agents were taking statements. Hale was across the room with an associate moving through paperwork with the efficiency of people who have a long night ahead. The crowd was finding its movement again. Phones out. Voices low. The particular hum of people who know they are standing inside a story but haven't yet decided how to tell it. I looked for Sarafina. I turned a full circle, checking each section of the room. She was not at the table where she had been standing. She was not near the entrance. She was not anywhere I could see. The main doors were still open. Past the attendants and the low conversations, I could see the street outside, yellow street lights on wet April pavement. Ordinary people moving past who had no idea what had happened in this building. Sarafina was gone. My first instinct was to go after her. To find her. To say something to close the gap that had been open between us for 3 years. And if I was honest, for longer than that. Then I thought of what Silas had told me in those first weeks in Maine in the mornings when I had been trying to force resolution on things that were not yet ready for it. Some things, he had said, are better approached when you are ready to hear the answer. I lowered my hand from the door frame I hadn't realized I'd reached. Sarafina had just done the hardest thing she had ever done in front of a room full of witnesses. She had walked out into the city afterward. That was her right. Some distances close on their own schedule if you leave them room to do it. I turned back to Silas. There was still work left to do tonight. And I was ready. I found my sister 20 minutes after the FBI escorted Grant out of the hall. She was standing on the sidewalk outside looking down at the wet pavement. Not trying to run. Not trying to disappear into the crowd moving around her. She was simply standing there as if she had been waiting. Even if she didn't know what she was waiting for. I stopped a few feet away. The street lights turned. The rain puddles amber. A cab rolled past without slowing. Someone behind us was still on a phone call. Voice sharp and urgent. Completely unaware that two sisters were standing 6 in apart and saying nothing. I looked at Serafina's face, thinner than I remembered, the sharp line of her jaw more visible now. Her eyes carrying a tiredness that had nothing to do with the hour. I thought of her at 12 years old. The one who cried the most when our father left for work trips. The one who would slide her hand under my bedroom door in the dark just to feel that I was still there. I always stayed. I always opened the door. I didn't know exactly when that changed. Only that it had quietly, without either of us naming it. She spoke first. "I know there's nothing I can say," she said. Her voice was flat. Not the sharp, polished tone I'd heard in the hallway months earlier. Just tired. I didn't argue with that. But I didn't walk away either. "Did you know about father?" I asked, about what he was given. About what was in his system. A long silence. A bus groaned past at the far end of the block. "I didn't know until it was too late to undo anything," she said. Finally. Then quieter. "I'm not asking you to believe me." I looked at her eyes. There are things people do with their face when they're performing grief. And there are things the face does on its own when the grief is real. What I saw in Serafina's expression that night was not a performance. Whether that absolved her of anything, I genuinely didn't know. And I understood, standing there on that cold April sidewalk, that the question of whether to believe her was not one I could answer in a single evening. Some questions need more than one night. Some wounds need more than one conversation. We stood together a little longer without speaking. Then she turned and walked away into the street. I watched her until she was gone. In the weeks that followed, I learned the legal outcome through Robert Hale. Because Serafina had voluntarily provided the recording to the FBI before Grant's arrest, handing over the evidence without being compelled, the court treated her as a cooperating witness. Under federal law, a cooperating witness who provides material evidence can receive significant consideration at sentencing. She was placed under supervised release during the investigation, meaning she was monitored by federal officers and required to check in regularly. But she did not face prison time. All corporate assets connected to the Vane Foundation were seized. She would appear before the court, but she would not be locked up. I did not intervene in either direction. I didn't ask for leniency, and I didn't push for a harsher outcome. I let the system do what systems are built to do. 6 weeks after the first hearing, a plain white envelope arrived at an address only Hale knew how to reach. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper in Serafina's handwriting. The same careful, slightly slanted cursive our father had taught us both. "I'm sorry I chose him over you. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. Take care of Leo." No signature. No way to write back. Even if I had wanted to. I read it twice. Then I folded it along its original crease and placed it in the bottom drawer of my oak desk. I didn't throw it away. I also didn't reply. There are wounds that a single apology cannot close. And relationships that need more than a letter to find their way back. I understood that. I thought she probably understood it, too. I closed the drawer. Then I stood up and looked out the window. Leo was running in wide, unsteady circles across the backyard, arms out for balance, laughing at something only he found funny. Silas was behind him, jogging with deliberate slowness, letting the boy believe he was winning. The June light came down warm and even across the grass, and Leo's small voice carried all the way through the glass. There are wounds that still need time. I know that. But there are also things visible through a window on an ordinary afternoon that don't need any more time to be real. And I was beginning to learn how to hold both at once, the drawer that was closed and the yard that was open. The letter I hadn't answered and the laugh I could hear right now. Neither one erasing the other. There are things that don't happen immediately after the big story ends. No sudden flash of light. No music rising from somewhere. Just an ordinary Monday morning with lukewarm coffee and Leo demanding pancakes shaped like rabbits, and I realized, standing at that stove with a spatula in my hand, that this was the part one had been waiting for the longest. Robert Hale told me the first time we met in person after the trial. Standing outside a coffee shop on Madison Avenue with paper cups and too much wind. "Your father built the sterling name over 40 years. You have the rest of your life to decide what it means from now on." I thought about that sentence every morning when I opened my laptop. Not with pressure. More like a compass. Grant's sentencing came in July. Conspiracy, commercial fraud, and an ongoing federal investigation into Edward Sterling's death. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. I sat 3 rows back and felt very little. Not numbness, but the particular stillness that comes when something that has been wrong for a long time is finally formally corrected. Sterling Corporation was returned to my control through the legal activation of the trust and the terms of my father's will. I did not move back into the Sterling mansion on the Upper East Side. Instead, I rented an apartment in Brooklyn where Leo had a backyard and Silas could set up a small woodworking bench in the garage. The corporation still operated out of Manhattan, and I went there 3 days a week. But I spent the first 6 months quietly dismantling every back-channel arrangement Grant had built, replacing them with transparent reporting structures and board accountability measures that my father had always intended, but never fully enforced. It was slow work. It was also, I found, the right kind of work. The relationship between Silas and me was not defined by a single large moment. It was built from evenings cooking together in a kitchen that smelled like cedar from the garage. From the night Silas fell asleep upright on the couch because he had stayed up watching Leo's temperature. From the Tuesday I found him at the kitchen table at midnight reading a book on antique conservation techniques. He looked up and said without embarrassment, "I'm trying to understand what you do. Not the corporation. Not the trust. The work I had loved since I was a girl. The careful, patient act of making broken things whole again." That sentence stayed with me longer than most. In November at dinner, Leo set down his fork with the seriousness of someone about to deliver important news. "Daddy Silas," he said, "are you going to be my daddy forever?" Silas looked across the table at me. I looked back at him. Neither of us answered immediately. Leo picked up his fork and kept eating, apparently satisfied that the question had been submitted and the adults could handle it from there. That night, after Leo was asleep, Silas placed a small box on the kitchen counter. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He just set it down and waited. Inside was a ring. White gold. Plain. No large stone. Nothing designed to impress from across the room. The kind of ring that asked to be looked at closely. I picked it up and turned it over. And there was an engraving on the inside of the band. Small enough that I had to tilt it toward the light to read it. "Always, Buddy." The words he had said to Leo on a birthday afternoon in Maine 3 years ago when a small boy had asked if he would always be there. Silas didn't get down on one knee. He looked at me and said, "I'm not good at speeches, but I'm very good at showing up. And I intend to keep showing up for you and for Leo for as long as you'll let me." I looked at the ring. Then I looked at him. 3 years ago, I had learned that some things appear beautiful from the outside and are empty at the center. And some things require no decoration because they are simply plainly real. I thought of the man who had carried Leo to school on a sore shoulder, who had taught a small boy to sandwood with patience, who had sat through a fever night without being asked, who had driven a motorcycle into a truck on a wet highway so I could have one more day. I didn't say anything. I just held out my hand. Our first Christmas as a family, not in the legal sense. Not in the sense that the world had recently decided to recognize. In the only sense I have ever believed. Is real. The people who choose to stay through the things that would make others leave. Leo had finally run out of energy somewhere around 9 o'clock and fallen asleep on the couch. One hand still curled around the small wooden car Silas had carved for him the week before. The tree in the corner blinked slowly in the dark stringing colored light across the ceiling in quiet pulses. Outside the window, snow was coming down over the Brooklyn rooftops. Not the aggressive kind that closes airports, but the soft, unhurried kind that makes the city briefly forgiving. Silas and I were sitting on the floor, backs against the couch, a small glass of red wine each. No music, just the sound of snow against glass and Leo's steady breathing above us. I thought about the woman 3 years ago who had stood outside a study door with her hand pressed against her stomach, heart going too fast, understanding for the first time that the house she lived in was not safe. She didn't know that night that the worst evening of her life was also the first step toward everything she would come to have. She had no way of knowing that. You never do when you're standing in the dark trying to decide which direction to walk. I reached over and placed my hand on Silas's right shoulder, exactly where the scar runs long, slightly raised, the kind of mark that doesn't fade the way people tell you scars fade. He didn't move away. Still hurt? I asked. Sometimes when it rains. He turned his head to look at me. Why? I just wanted to know. He nodded once and we went back to the quiet. That was enough of an answer for both of us. I looked at Leo sleeping at the wooden car loosely held in his small fist, and I thought about what it means to restore something. Not to make it look as though it was never broken. Not to sand down the evidence of everything it survived. Real restoration. The kind my father taught me. The kind I had practiced since I was old enough to hold a brush means understanding why something was made to last and then working carefully to make sure it still can. You don't hide the repair. You make the repair worthy of the object. Silas had a scar on his shoulder because he had driven into a truck on a wet highway in the dark for a woman whose name he knew, but whose face he had never clearly seen. He had done it because someone had asked him to. Yes. But also I had come to believe because it was simply the kind of person he was. The scar was not something to apologize for or feel guilty about. It was proof. It was the most honest thing about that night. More honest than any document, any court record, any piece of evidence filed with the FBI. It said he was there. He chose it. Before I had any way to choose him back. I kept my hand where it was. If I could go back knowing everything. Every night of fear. Every week of hiding. Every morning of pretending to be someone else for Leo's sake. I would still walk out that side door into the rain. Every time. Not because the pain was worth it in some clean philosophical sense, but because every step of that road led here to this floor. This tree. This sleeping boy. This man with a scar on his shoulder. Who had read books about antique restoration at midnight just to understand the thing I loved. The snow kept falling outside. Leo shifted in his sleep and resettled without waking. The tree blinked on. Silas placed his hand over mine. Not moving it. Not squeezing hard. Just covering it. The way you set a hand on something you intend to stay near. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. I am Caroline Sterling, heir to the sterling name, restorer of broken things. The woman who ran into a March rainstorm with a child she hadn't yet met. And no clear idea of where she was going. I had crossed everything else to reach this moment. It was enough. It was more than enough. Some nights I still ask myself, if I had stayed quiet from the beginning, would it have hurt less? And every time the answer is the same. No. Because silence isn't peace. It's just fear wearing a different coat. I don't have perfect advice to offer. But if you're standing at some kind of door right now, stomach full of fear, no clear direction forward, please don't do what I did. Don't wait until you have no options left before you start trusting yourself. Trust yourself earlier. Move earlier. I'm not someone who talks about faith easily. But looking back at everything from that rainy night to this Christmas light, I believe there are things that can't be explained by planning or luck alone. I think God was present in the turns I thought were wrong directions. Family betrayal never comes from strangers. It comes from people who know your name, know your fears, and choose to use those things as weapons. Family revenge isn't about burning everything down. Sometimes it's simply standing your ground and letting the truth do its own work. And family betrayal, no matter how deep, does not mean your story ends there. What I want to say clearly is this. I believe family revenge done right is not destruction. It's restoration. And family betrayal, in whatever form it takes, never has the right to define who you are unless you hand it that power. That's the part one wish someone had told me sooner. This was my story. What does yours look like? Leave a comment below. I'd genuinely love to know. If something here stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it today. And if you want to keep following stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for staying until the very end. That means more than you know. A small note. Going forward, the stories ahead contain fictional elements constructed purely for educational and reflective purposes. If that's not what you're looking for right now, that's completely fine. Step away. Find what fits you better. And come back whenever you're ready. The door stays open. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.